And yes, thank you. We had a volunteer appreciation event in the sukkah before services that I know many of you saw on your way in. Some of you joined on your way in. It was the first real in-person ARC clinic event we have had since March 13th, 2020. So it was a really beautiful thing, I think, for all of us. And many thanks to Noah Habib, who I did not expect to see when I just looked up into the balcony. I'm glad you're still here. And I'm very grateful to welcome Reinhard and Alejandra, who stayed tonight, who were among our first friends to come to clinic when we started in person in May of 2019. So just before Rosh Hashanah, there are lots of Facebook groups on Facebook for clergy. Where else would they be? Where we share notes with each other and share sermon ideas and all kinds of things. And a friend of mine who has been a rabbi at her synagogue for about 15 years shared in the group her anxiety that her sermons, she felt, were no longer original, that she was saying the same things over and over again, and she was worried lest her community start to feel that she was getting repetitive. So by way of consolation, I pointed out that her congregants, and in fact, Jews everywhere, have been reading the same machzor every year, the same Torah every week, and somehow we haven't gotten permanently sick of it yet. When I was growing up, my family went to Shabbat services almost every night, every Friday night. In the synagogue where I grew up, the kids all got to sit in sort of the place of honor. There were these funky wooden benches that surrounded the bima, and it was like we got the front row seats. It was very exciting that we got to sit there. And nevertheless, despite our front row seats, we sat there whispering to each other, sometimes singing along, sometimes pinching each other. Every now and then we would escape to the kitchen and get the chocolate chip cookies that the adults hid in the freezer. And I suspect that the adults watching us thought, are they learning anything? What are they going to retain from this experience when they're just sitting there nudging each other and whispering about their favorite cartoons? But I think, as most of us know, there's a deep wisdom to doing ritual on a regular basis, because even if you think you don't know something, if you have come to synagogue on a regular basis for a couple of months, you know the Shema. If you come for more than a year on a regular basis, you know the V'ahavta. The words start to sink into you and become part of who you are. And we don't always realize how those things sink into us. When I went to Jewish summer camp at age 8, it was the first time I did Jewish ritual, anywhere other than with my family and or in my synagogue. And the first Friday night service was frankly really confusing. I was kind of wondering, wait, do I know any of this? But we got to, Oseh Shalom Bimromav, and something clicked in my 8-year-old brain, and I was like, oh, this is home. Oh, I know this. This is part of me. This is part of who I am. And in that moment, I suddenly felt deeply connected to the people around me and also to my family at home. And little did I know, eventually, kind of to the entire world of Jews that have ever existed through that piece of what felt like was in my soul. The funny thing is that I grew up thinking that melody had been like carried down from Sinai, and it's only thanks to Joyce Rosenzweig and CBST that I learned that Nurit Hirsch, who composed that, is like just turned 80 this summer. She lives in Israel. That melody is not much older than I am, actually. But even so, I actually met somebody under the sukkah, at a friend's sukkah this week, who grew up in a Haredi community, who has since come out as a lesbian and is now living out and not so much in Jewish community. And I, in conversation, mentioned to her, so when you do Havdalah, do you do that lie, lie, la, 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 lie, lie? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, did you know that a lesbian wrote that song? Because her Haredi community had done it forever, and she had absolutely no idea. But these things become part of who we are. So we all have the different texts, the different melodies that sort of connect us to who we are, to our communities, to our history. Books and poems, sometimes movies or TV shows that we fall in love with, and sometimes unexpectedly. But there are so many books and songs that I fell in love with as a kid, as a teenager, that now make me feel like I'm returning home, or returning to an earlier version of myself, or sometimes returning to the feeling of having learned something so momentous that it helped me better understand the world and who I was in it. So some of the books that have shaped me, and of course the list would be much too long to go into here. I would be here for another few hours. I would never subject you to that, I promise. But Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, both volumes of Mouse by Art Spiegelman, Shel Silverstein's poetry, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. And all of these books that I just named have three things in common. First, each one taught me something new about the world and or about myself. I have reread each of them more times than I can count. I've even taught a few. And now returning to them feels like coming home. Second, each has won multiple major awards, recognized as deeply important and beautiful works of art. And third, each one has been banned in school districts and in libraries, and is still being challenged regularly alongside much newer books that I did not grow up with. The Bluest Eye has been banned in Missouri school districts and beyond for including sexually explicit language, and as the school board wrote, disturbing language. Disturbing. A Wrinkle in Time has been regularly challenged even in public schools and libraries by Christian groups who argue that the book undermines their theology. Where the Sidewalk Ends, this is my favorite, by Shel Silverstein, was pulled from a school library after complaints that the poems encouraged drug use, the occult, and disrespect for authority. Heavens. And Slaughterhouse-Five, I mean, really now, Slaughterhouse-Five has been banned many, many, many times since it was published in 1972 for referring to sex and violence, for disturbing images, and for curse words, which, to be clear, it's a book about a young man's experience of war. And Mouse was recently pulled off library shelves in Tennessee schools due to objections. This will never fail to baffle me. Objections having to do with nudity and curse words. Nude cartoon mice in a book about the Holocaust. I know, I don't, anyway. Anyway, so just before Rosh Hashanah was actually Banned Books Week, the American Library Association's week of calling attention to these, the efforts to ban books and encouraging people to, actually read those books and to fight back against efforts to ban books. This is more and more important because these efforts to pull books off of shelves have been spreading further and further. And have started happening actually in the school that I went to in Connecticut, and that has been a fight that I am currently fighting with some friends. And this is going further and further in the state of New York as well, although I don't think in the city yet, but we don't know. Now I started talking about synagogue, right? And the texts and the songs that we return to here week after week and year after year. And I will say that some of these texts and songs come back to me at very random times. This summer, there was one week walking in my neighborhood up in Washington Heights, very, very Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. I'm often kind of humming to myself or singing as I walk, and there was a man walking towards me in a black hat who was looking at me strangely, which actually doesn't often happen in my neighborhood, and I suddenly realized I was humming Kol Nidre. I think it was July. Okay. But it's in there somewhere, and it comes out at odd times, right? I also, before we even started planning services for Sukkot, was walking through Fort Tryon Park one day and suddenly found myself singing Shlomit Bona Sukkah and thinking, okay, wait, no, we haven't even gotten to Yom Kippur yet. Slow down, it's okay. So even now, also, when we sing the Nurit Hirsch Oseh Shalom, I am sometimes brought back to that 8-year-old part of myself, suddenly realizing that there was a text and a melody that I had that was going to be my home, right? It didn't matter where I went or who I was with. There was something inside me that had been a gift from my tradition and from my community that would always be a home wherever I traveled. This summer, some of you were on Zoom with me for a panel discussion through the Museum of Jewish Heritage downtown that focused on the experiences of LGBTQ people in Germany just before World War II. You've probably all seen photos from the first and largest book burning that took place in Berlin. The photos are painfully memorable, a pile of books and papers, massive pile blazing, with a circle of young men surrounding it, some of them with their arms in the air. I'd seen these photos many, many times, but what I did not learn until I was an adult is what books and papers were being burned in that first major book burning. The collection was a massive library of material on sex and gender, books and research about homosexuality and transgender people. I see nods. I know many of you know this history. Some of you probably don't. It's not something that we generally get taught, which is a shame. Years' worth of scientific research, much of which was totally unique to this one library. The first massive Nazi book burning on May 6, 1933, targeted the Institute for the Science of Sexuality, founded by Magnus Hirschfeld, a gay German Jew. It was the first step towards the Nazis' goal to erase, to really eradicate both Jewish and LGBTQ life. Nazi ideology still today links homosexuality and Judaism as being degenerate, that terrible word that was used to ban not only books, but art and music and so many different forms of cultural production. Hirschfeld founded the Institute in 1919, and in the 1920s and 30s was known, I love this, as the Einstein of sex. If I had known when I was young that one could aspire to be the Einstein of sex, I feel like there might have been a different career trajectory, but I am neighbors with Dr. Ruth. I will let that be enough. And he wrote about the people that he worked with and treated and welcomed at his research center and clinic, and even created language that did not exist before to describe people that he was encountering. Because the people, right, we, LGBTQ folks, have always existed, but the language that we've used and the language that has been used on us has changed over the years. The Institute hired transgender researchers and nurses, offered social groups and support groups, and offered healthcare, including what we now call gender-affirming surgeries, the first ones, and held this amazing library where Hirschfeld collected and created material that would include eventually over 20,000 volumes. Hirschfeld was out of the country when the Nazis invaded his building and carried off the library and burned 20,000 books. All of the medical records, including detailed notes about hormones and surgeries, diaries and letters, stories and poetry, an entire library of texts that Hirschfeld and his colleagues had created to help others find themselves. In the newsreels, it was reported that Germany had destroyed, in quotes, the intellectual garbage of the past. I cannot even begin to imagine how many of us in the LGBTQ world today would have found ourselves in some of those books and found connections to ancestors in those writings. Those who burned his library had begun with the language of protecting German youth and did not stop, as we know, with burning books. And today, we see people around this country calling for beloved books to be removed from libraries and schools to protect children. And I see that bonfire just down the road. Book banning goes after books specifically that give minorities the representation that makes us feel that we've found home, that we've found a story we fit into. Those calling for banning books to protect children aren't interested in protecting children who are LGBTQ or children who are Jewish or Muslim or any other minority. Now, thank goodness this is, I will say, a golden age of great books for kids that focus on queer characters, LGBTQ families, non-Christian protagonists, Black kids, Asian kids. And these books, the ones where transgender kids and others can find themselves and see their stories, are the ones most frequently being attacked. I cannot tell you how many times as a child I would find a book I loved and a character I deeply identified with, and then the family would put up a Christmas tree, and I'd be like, okay, all right. Or it turned out sometimes, C.S. Lewis, that the entire story turned out to be an allegory for Jesus. It was mildly traumatizing, actually not so mildly traumatizing when I got to the last book, and I really wanted, it is rare in my life that I want to fling a book across a room, but that was one of those moments. And similarly, I did not read a book that included a gay character. I had to think really hard about this until I was in graduate school in my 20s. I absolutely love that kids today have access to an ever-increasing range of stories with people of all kinds. Right? Decades ago, if you found a story with a Jewish character in it, it was like finding a unicorn. It was like so exciting. I mean, I read some really bad Jewish kids' books when I was a kid because there weren't many, and some of them were really bad. But some of the best Jewish books I found, like Chaim Potak's novels, which I probably read younger than I should have, and Isaac Bashevis Singer's stories, likewise, a lot of those included nudity, sexuality, disturbing language. And I am so deeply grateful that those books were available to me. I am so deeply grateful that I eventually found really good LGBTQ literature out there because I found home in so many of those books. They continue to stay with me. And I hope that kids today who are LGBTQ don't experience the same kind of really like loneliness that came from walking into a library and kind of despairing of ever finding something that felt like me on the shelf. And I find it so sad when adults who really should know better treat the presence of LGBTQ people in a book as some kind of degeneracy that straight children and teens need to be protected from. When we come to synagogue, we return to everything that is in the Siddur and in the Machzor, the divine and the devastating. Right? We don't skip those chapters of the Torah. We talk about them. Sometimes we kind of talk about the parts we'd rather talk about, but we don't not chant them out loud. And when I return here especially, I return to all of you and to all the stories that we have been part of together over the years. I return to the texts and songs that shaped who I am and where I can find myself again. A story. Of course, a story. In my first year as a rabbinical student, I taught Hebrew school in a suburban conservative synagogue outside of Philadelphia. I taught 6th and 7th grade, which initially seemed terrifying, but the kids quickly convinced me that they really were the best possible age to teach. They were deeply opinionated. They were a hilarious mix of enthusiastic and jaded, and they loved thinking and talking about complex history and concepts. So I had the 6th graders learning about colonial American Jewish life, each of them getting an individual historical figure to learn about and sort of inhabit their story a bit. And together we made a map of where the first generation of Jews in America had come from. Of course, the first real community of Jews in America came fleeing the Inquisition and arrived in New York, not exactly intentionally. And so we learned about Sephardic Jews and different traditions that were once the majority here before my Ashkenazi ancestors and millions of others arrived. And one of the boys one week came in with his face glowing. He was like bouncing on his feet with excitement the way only an 11-year-old can. And he told us, "My dad's family is Sephardic. I showed my dad our map, and he said his mom spoke the same language that they did." Aaron's dad told me that Shabbat that he had never heard Sephardic Jews mentioned once at their synagogue. He had given up years before trying to introduce one Ladino song to the community because people just had no concept, they had no context for it. And he thought, okay, they're not going to see it. I'm not, that part of me is not represented here. And then suddenly, his 11-year-old came home from Hebrew school, and he saw that he was seen. There was a whole part of his family history that he found himself in. And for his kids, his 11 and 8-year-old kids, they wound up learning something new about, not only about Jewish history and about, going to Hebrew school, but they really learned something so deep about themselves and their own family history, their own inheritance, that it really not only transformed this one family, but it transformed a lot of the relationship with the community. We are the people of the book. We are people of text and song and stories. Wherever we go, we collect more. We are enriched by it. We bring it wherever we go next, and we take it with us, and that's our home, is the melodies and the texts, right? We don't need the physical space so much. We dwell in those texts. We dwell in our stories. And I hope we can all continue to find ways to make sure that this full, beautiful, expanding, glorious range of stories continues to be accessible to everyone who's seeking home in them, so that everyone who needs them will find them. Shabbat Shalom.